Forget traditional sci-fi, or as it's correctly called, genre SF. The slipstream is where it's at. What is slipstream science fiction? Well, I'm going to unpack that for you now. Welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, bookseller, collector. Let's get into it. If you've watched my video from a few weeks back, Science Fiction and Historical Context, which outlines the evolution of SF against the rise of technology and society from proto-SF onwards, to scientific romance, to genre SF, you already know what slipstream SF is. If not, there's a link at the end of this video to that video. Slipstream is a term that first came into use in the 1980s in SF circles, and it was interpreted in a number of ways. More on that later on. But basically, slipstream SF is science fiction which is published, packaged and marketed without the label SF or science fiction. It is packaged and published as general fiction. You'll notice in publishing, especially when you go in a bookshop, there are, if you look, science fiction books shelved and displayed amongst the general fiction, outside of and away from the sections labelled science fiction and fantasy. These books are often quite famous. Some of them have been bestsellers for decades and decades, like, for example, Brave New World, or A Clockwork Orange, or 1984. Here's a rare example of 1984 presented in a genre SF livery in the Masterwork series. Very good edition that you don't see very much. There's also classic examples like Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is the UK first edition. And The Road by Cormac McCarthy. This is also the UK first edition. There are many writers who have built their careers and reputations by writing what is often referred to as literary fiction, or as I call it, mainstream fiction, fiction which is not genre fiction. These SF novels, which are not packaged, marketed or labelled as science fiction, are slipstream SF. Books which are packaged, labelled and marketed as science fiction are genre SF. As Norman Spinrad said when he was asked to define science fiction, he said it's anything which has science fiction printed on it. I think it's wider than that. So, throughout this video, I'm going to flash up some examples, most of them recent, of slipstream SF novels that you may have missed that I have covered on this channel that you should look into. So genre SF is the publishing category based around the conventions and presentation techniques used in the pulp magazines from 1926 onwards. For it was at that date that science fiction, the term, was coined. The first of these magazines to bear the terminology science fiction was, of course, Amazing Stories, edited by Hugo Gernsback, who was also the publisher, and he called it scientifiction. But a fan wrote in and said, that doesn't work. Conflated words are always horrible. Let's call it science fiction. And he was right. At this point, the publishing category of genre SF was born. Before this, everything was in the slipstream. Everything was excluded because science fiction as a term did not exist. And the term science fiction was not printed on a book until about 1948. The science fiction that we think of as definitive sci-fi was all published in pulp magazines. Previously, when science fiction was referred to at all before 1926, it was being called scientific romance, and it had been called that for a long time. And Wells, for example, called his work scientific romances. Historians, critics and readers were quick to identify examples of genre SF published outside the magazine tradition. And while they made convincing cases for the inclusion of these books within the new genre label science fiction, in most cases, these books continued to be marketed as general fiction. And due to the generic quality of much of the work published in the pulp magazines, there was a tendency to judge genre SF, pure science fiction, by its worst excesses rather than by its best writing. However, genre SF had a raw power and imaginative energy that reflected the pace of technological and social change in the 20th century. It was bold, innovative, and at its best full of telling metaphors that said more about our world than general fiction did. General fiction was still fixated on characters and social mores, and much of the time it still is. Genre SF, sometimes crude, was nonetheless the fiction of ideas and philosophical investigation, though not in a linguistic sense. In the 1960s, the British new wave science fiction magazine New Worlds, edited by Michael Moorcock, attempted to rebalance the quality of literary disparity between genre SF and the slipstream. So writers like J.G. Ballard, Moorcock himself, Brian Aldiss, British writers with one foot in the literary fiction camp, were joined by Americans like Thomas M. Dish, Norman Spinrad and Samuel R. Delany in merging the raw stuff of genre SF with the advanced literary techniques of modernism. Younger authors like M. John Harrison and Christopher Priest joined them. Christopher Priest in particular was at pains to remind readers and commentators that SF had always been part of a British literary tradition, and that the American magazine packaging and ghettoizing of science fiction as genre SF was a recent mass market phenomenon, and this had put the intellectual pursuit of SF into popular forms that were often not much different to other genres. Gradually, the tropes, approaches and energy of genre fiction spread back into the mainstream from the genre, and general fiction was taken even further, until by the 1970s and 1980s, critics were lionizing writers like Ballard, Moorcock and Priest for reinfecting the mainstream with genre SF tropes, energy and ideas. Their most advanced works were starting to be published at that point. They were marketed not as genre SF, but in mainstream liveries. They were slipstream. After the advent of cyberpunk in the 1980s, the liminal space of slipstream reared its head, and the term was used a lot, primarily by Bruce Sterling, who introduced it to the mainstream. The slipstream is a borderland between genre SF and literary general fiction, and that was where the action was in the late 1980s, and it's where the action is now, as I say. Let's take an example. Lucius Shepard had broken through in the Terry Carr A Special series. This is the American first edition, the world first edition of Green Eyes, presented in an A format paperback with a classic sci-fi livery. But here we have the UK edition of The Jaguar Hunter, his first short story collection, presented in a very literary imprint and Paladin, and as you see it's in the larger B format. So it's a different kind of presentation implying a different type of writing. And this is the UK first of Life During Wartime, packaged and published not as a sci-fi novel, but as a sophisticated piece of modern literature. So Slipstream SF was characterized by the B format, not the A format, the subtle, discreet artwork, modernist, not pulpy. Against the backdrop of cyberpunk, one of its key practitioners, Bruce Sterling, coined the term slipstream to differentiate between genre SF and non-genre SF. If you look up Slipstream SF in the SF Encyclopedia by Clute and Nichols in his third edition, now a website rather than a book, you can see that Slipstream SF is defined as a term devised by Bruce Sterling, in part as a pun or an echo of mainstream, to designate stories which make use of SF devices but which are not genre SF. The image slipstream is either nautical or aeronautical. A ship or airplane, either of which stands for genre SF, can create a slipstream, a current, which may be strong enough to give non-paying passengers, writers who are not saying, yes, I'm a science fiction writer, a free ride. As a description of commercial piggybacking, the term seems apt. However, when used to designate the whole range of non-genre SF, which the SF Encyclopedia calls fabulation, the term, which implies a relationship of dependency, can seem derogatory. In my view, the slipstream is very, very much the science fiction that is outside the packaging of genre SF, which I said started in 1926. So there are lots and lots of examples out there of slipstream science fiction if you go and look for them. Increasingly, more and more writers are working outside genre fiction, packaging and publishing. They've drawn on the pioneering concepts created by genre SF writers, sometimes crudely, sometimes improving on these ideas by expressing them in more finely crafted, character-focused prose, ensuring that society as a microcosm is depicted in SF terms. Genre SF is usually macroscopic, expressing its ideas on a big blockbuster scale. While this makes for spectacle, it often sidelines specific humanity of characters in the eye of the story. As technology came to affect our lives more and more subtly, impactfully, and in an even manner, think of the ubiquity of the mobile phone and AI. So did science fiction at its best infect general literature via Slipstream SF. Slipstream SF is often, but not always, near future SF, but it is where usually the best science fiction of this century can be found. This is another reason why so little traditional SF is published now, because the cutting edge is now staining the waters of the mainstream so darkly that the slipstream is out there for you to claim, so just go for it. There have been other uses of the term, however. If you went back to the 80s into a large branch of Forbidden Planet, for example, like the one in London, it was often applied to fiction that felt like science fiction, but wasn't. Cult books, the kind of things that people would move on to from SF. This doesn't happen so much more. Back in my day when I was younger, you'd move on to reading the Beat Generation and all the cult writers that are out there, people like Charles Bukowski, William Burroughs, all those kind of things. And if you went into Forbidden Planet, you would see the stocking of these cult books, both fiction and non-fiction, in a bay labelled Slipstream. At the top of the bay there'd be a header card with Slipstream, and all these cult books, both fiction and non-fiction, often related to the counterculture of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, in that bay. So Slipstream came to be things that felt like SF or influenced SF. For example, William Gibson, he said part of his inspiration for Neuromancer was as much a anthology of Beat Generation writing as it was Alfred Bester. This is what I've seen over the last 5 decades in my job as a bookseller, with a special interest in SF. Slipstream is out there. Go and investigate it. I review a lot of Slipstream on this channel because that is where the action is, and it's often the best stuff. Traditional genre SF is sadly on the way out. There's less and less of it being published. Publishers are more interested in fantasy, and it's repeating the same old space opera fantasy that people, by now, if you've been reading a while, it's just not going to do it for you. Go for something more cutting edge. The Slipstream is alive and well. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, there's a members area, an exclusive video every week for $4.99 a month. There's also over 600 other videos here, interviews, charts, all sorts of things. And hope you enjoyed that. Like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.